Good evening. On behalf of Rabbi Dov Silver from Madraigos, we'd like to welcome each and every one of you for coming. Of course, these days, once a Zoom link goes out, it definitely makes it more convenient, so we're welcoming all those, and I understand there are many who have already logged on online. But before we begin, and I introduced our moderator and our guest panelists and speakers, I think it would be remiss if we didn't begin our evening by asking Rabbi Silver to come up and to say a kapitel tehillim for all of the cholim and the families who have been so gravely affected by the horrific tragedy in Surfside.
Thank you, Rabbi Bender. I also want to have in mind all the cholim in our community who are suffering so much from the topic of what we're about to discuss. So if everyone can have in mind that as well, that there are really people out here by us in our next door that are really, really under tremendous straits on dealing with this issue. Shir la malos esoinai el harim me'ayin yavo Ezri. Ezri me'im Adonai oseh shomayim va'aretz. Al yitein lamot raglecha, al yanum shomrecha. Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan, shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomrecha, Adonai tzilcha, yad yaminecha. Yomam hashemesh lo yakeka, v'yoreach ba'aloylam. Adonai yishmorcha mikol ra, yishmor es nafshecha. Adonai yishmor teisecha vo'echa me'atavi adolam. Chenik chobeis Yisrael nesum b'tzaro b'shiv le'im d'mayam u'bein be'abash ha'mokim yirachem aleim v'yotzim l'tzol l'ravacha me'afel l'ora l'shibud ge'ula hashta b'agalav zman kariv v'nomar amen.
I want to, in particular, thank Mrs. Mindy Werblowski and Mrs. Milka Kielsen, who worked tirelessly for many weeks setting up this entire event. And on behalf of the entire community, we thank you for your efforts. Before we introduce the commissioner who will give opening remarks, I just want to turn to my right, and I want to save time, and I also know they don't like to be spoken about, so I won't read their bios, which are all very long. But we have next to my right, on my right, three just amazing people who, each of who I know, I speak for Rabbi Silver and myself, that we really look up to and admire in so many ways. Just going in order, we have Dr. Elliot Solomon, who is a neurologist in our community, who has been there for our community day and night, and has seen so many of the issues that we will hear about. Next in, we have Dr. Benjamin Tepfer, who I speak to far too often than I wish to admit, but who has such immense and incredible knowledge to share with us. And on my closest to my right, Dr. David Pelkowitz, who I don't even feel appropriate introducing, who's been a mentor to so many of us personally. And I think that on behalf of our entire community, having a panel with these gentlemen here is something very, very special. Several weeks ago, when Rabbi Silver opened the eyes of myself and many, and considering what we do, we thought we knew a lot. I want to give Rabbi Silver the recognition he deserves for really pushing this event to happen, and really for doing what he does behind the scenes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's beyond words. Following a meeting where I sat with Rabbi Silver and learned so much, I got on the phone with the Nassau County Police Commissioner, Commissioner Ryder. I'm going to call him up. He doesn't like being spoken about either. And the reason why I called him was simple. Commissioner Ryder may not live in the Five Towns, but he's literally a Five Towns boy, as we call him. And he has been extremely passionate, day and night, about this topic. Not only when you see it in the media, or when you hear about him, but he's been a warrior and a fighter specifically. He just told me on the side that he doesn't like driving to the Five Towns, but he loves when he gets into the Five Towns. Those are his exact words. And as soon as he heard that we were doing something, he said, I'd like to open the evening. I mean, we asked him, he's not looking for speaking gigs, but because this is something that he's literally as passionate as anybody, and understanding the details, the intricacies of the law, which has made our lives a lot harder, we're honored that he's here. And just to give some opening remarks, Commissioner Patrick Ryder.
So I'm not used to microphones because I'm pretty loud to begin with, but I did say that. I hate driving down here from Mineola at 5 o'clock, and it's just the worst place. But I love when I get here. And I say it all the time to Rabbi Bender, is that what I love about the Five Towns community is that they love their police. They love law and order. They love quality of life. Coming here today and to speak about a little bit about marijuana and stuff, and this great panel that you're going to hear from is so important that we engage. We have to really embrace what this change is. Look, it's done. The law's been passed. Marijuana is now legal for up to 3 ounces. They can walk down the public street here and smoke a marijuana cigarette. But what is it doing to our kids? And yes, they can put an age restriction. It's 21. That doesn't mean the 18. And I don't know who the 18-year-old is, who the 21. We have a problem with alcohol to begin with. Substance abuse is a huge problem in society today. Almost every single issue we deal with in law enforcement, there's some touch of a substance abuse, whether it's an abusive family from alcohol or drugs on a child, whether that kid grew up in a family that's drugs involved, whether he's dealing drugs, whether they're doing robberies to support their habit, whether they're doing or selling drugs to support their habit. We see it all over here in Nassau County. You live in the safest county in America. We have lowered crime again this year by another 10%. When shootings and homicides are up all over the country, Nassau County's homicides are down 40%. We do it by an intelligence-led model. We do it as evidence-based approach. We are respectful to our communities. We had over 330 protests here in Nassau County. No one was assaulted. There was no violence. There was no criminal mischief. There was inconvenience while people exercised their First Amendment, and then they went home at the end of the night. And as my chief would always say to me, if tomorrow everybody who's angry at you today can get up and go to that bagel store and get their bagel and coffee in the morning as they go to work, they'll be okay with the inconvenience they had the night before because nothing was burnt down. And that's the kind of respect that we had for our community, and that's why we got through the unrest and the protest. But when marijuana got first put on the agenda up in Albany, we wrote a report. And I urge you all to go to the Nassau County website, look up EO 203, and the marijuana report is in there. And we took the data from a place that we call HIDTA. HIDTA stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas. They're an agency for the government that oversees funding to fight issues of substance abuse in this country. They went and they took the data from Colorado. I trust them in the data that they're giving me. And it comes from the law enforcement agencies. And it showed the numbers of black market marijuana increased, violence in the communities increased, driving while impaired marijuana increased. It's a concern. We cannot test somebody for marijuana like we can alcohol. We can't ask you to take a breathalyzer and get a read about if you've been smoking marijuana. So we're not going to know. Nobody in a car is allowed to smoke marijuana while that car is being operated. But if you all just came from smoking marijuana down the street and got in that car, we all know what it smells like. The entire car will smell like somebody's been smoking marijuana. If I take out the wrong person and I try to make that arrest because they're impaired, I'm going to have liability issues with the police department. And so it's a very difficult change that we're going through. My biggest complaint, and I thought I'd see more of it on the street, my biggest complaint comes from people's backyards and their parties. You're having your bar mitzvah in the backyard. You got a large crowd. Your neighbor next door is having 10 friends over. They're smoking marijuana. That smell comes over your fences. We know it's not even like cigarette smoke, which will last a little bit of a distance. Marijuana, once it's lit up, goes a long way out. You're going to call me and you're going to say, oh, Commissioner, we got a problem. They're smoking marijuana. I want you to do something. There's absolutely nothing I can do. Nothing. So those kids in that backyard that appear to be 21 years of age are smoking marijuana, and there goes your bar mitzvah party that destroyed because of what's going on in the yard next door. But what about those kids that are smoking the marijuana? These kids put marijuana, the THC, into vape pipes. They vape it. When you vape it, there's no smell. So I believe they're vaping nicotine, like most vape pipes are used for, but they're actually vaping the THC from the marijuana. there are three parts to marijuana. There's the CBD oil, there's the hemp, and of course the THC part of it. In the hemp, they make rope out of it. They make material from it. The CDC, the CBD oil, it's used. Many women, my wife uses on my dog. My dog takes the CBD. There's nothing wrong with it. It's legal. It's purchased over the counter. My dog walks a little funny every once in a while, but then comes the THC part of it, and that's what's now been legalized. A kid can carry up to 3 ounces of marijuana on him. When the marijuana shops open up, it's January, and we all know why it was pushed to January, because in election years you don't want to make change. So this January, the shops open up. Those shops that open up will then be able to legally sell marijuana. The taxed marijuana. When you tax, government taxes anything, it goes higher. The illegal marijuana that's sold on the street will continue to be sold. You can grow up to 10 plants per person in your house. If there are 3 people in a house, that's 30 plants. That 30 plants, if you're not using it or nobody else in the house, that's 30 plants you're going to sell on the black market. And then we always come back to, what about the money that is generated from marijuana? Where does it go? And if from the legal side of it, again, setting up the shops, that will go back to the government, and it'll be divided up how the government feels in the law that it's written. Each county will get a piece of it, even if they opt out. Originally, if you opted out, you'd get no money. Now, if you opt out, you still get some of the money. So where does it go? Does marijuana an indicator to go to higher drugs? Now in Colorado, they just legalized hallucinogenic mushrooms because the marijuana is not good enough. They also formed a committee, voted unanimously across the board in Colorado. They need to do research on the damage that marijuana is doing to their kids. You didn't know this before you legalized it? We all know your brain doesn't develop. I think it's 23 years of age. So them smoking that marijuana with the problems. So the one thing I will say that's the positive out of this is that I thought we'd be walking down our streets and I'd be smelling it everywhere. I'm not. I'm really, truly not. The other day at the beach, I did, right? A public beach, but they're not supposed to be smoking it, like they're not supposed to be smoking cigarettes. So that's the good side. We're still a respectful community. We believe in law and order. We believe in quality of life, and our children are respectful that they may be going other places. But the other side of it is, well, does it get worse, and how it grows and what it does to our society? We're not going to know. We're supposed to learn from our mistakes. We're supposed to learn from our history. And again, we look at what's going on in Colorado right now. I will say this to you all. I have 3 children. They're 22 years of age. That's triplets that just graduated college, and for the first time in my life, I've got money in my pocket again. So, not much, but watch them. Look at them. I just spoke to a good friend of mine today who spoke to me about his son who's going through what he believes is a breakdown, a depression, and we're trying to get him help. And he started from doing drugs at college. A wonderful kid. Keep your kids close to you. Ask them the questions. Have the conversations with them. Look, alcohol's not good for you either, right? But we all sometimes go out to dinner and have a few drinks. If you can control it, you're fine. If you can't, you shouldn't have it. You never should be driving. These conversations we need to have with our kids. They're the most precious thing we've ever been given by God, and we got to make sure that we protect them. So, again, the Nassau County Police Department will do everything we can to support you. I'm back again this Wednesday. I'll be miserable all the way down here, but then I'll be happy when I get here. So I thank you for giving me the time to address you all tonight, and I wish you all well. Thank you. Thank you.
Before we introduce our moderator, I also wanted to recognize Mr. Sholem Klein, who's the director of the RNSP for our neighborhood, as well as the commanding officer of community affairs in the NYPD, and the other side of the A78, Deputy Inspector Richie Taylor, a good friend of our communities. Thank you for being here, Richie. Without further ado, as not as somebody involved in this event, just as a parent, I look forward to the panel and all that they have to present and offer. Our moderator tonight, I believe is probably as well known as anybody in our community, and who has done so much for everybody on both sides of the 878, no matter what area, business, or office he held. But he's extremely passionate about tonight's topics and is as suited as anyone. And on behalf of Rabbi Silver, Madraigos, and our entire team, we'd like to have Mr. Phil Goldfeder take it away.
And I thought I was the politician. So thank you. It is really actually nice to see humans back again live and in person. I mean, we did a number of these via webinar for different topics, but it's harder to talk to a camera and hope someone's listening. Now we get to watch and see the reactions and make sure that we're really covering the topics as well as we should. So again, thank you so much to Achiezer for their help, and Rabbi Bender for everything that you do on a daily basis. And of course, to our host tonight, Madraigos, run by Silver. There's not enough to say about the work that Madraigos does on a daily basis. I mean, we all hear the stories. You read a thank you article in the newspaper every now and again, but it is all the stories think about that you're not hearing, and all the calls that you're not being told about. Those are the ones that really tear at the heartstrings and really put these staffs through the things, through the troubles and the agmas nefesh that they have to go through. And so a tremendous thank you to Achiezer and, of course, to Madraigos for the work they do on a daily basis. So a huge round of applause to them. And, of course, to my partner in crime, Sharon Gross. I saw her before, for your work. Thank you so much. It was great to see you. And, of course, to our clinical director, Mrs. Mindy Warbolowski, who is here tonight, and, again, spearheading another great program. And so our panelists were already introduced. The goal for tonight is to not hear me. You are the experts. You are the folks who have to deal with these issues that come up on a daily basis. As we've heard, Rabbi Bender calls each and every one of you. Rabbi Silver calls you when he has questions and nuanced approaches. And I think it's an opportunity for parents and everybody gathered here to hear directly from you about some of the things. And so I think it's most appropriate to start for me as a former elected official. I can tell you I very proudly voting against. When I was in the assembly, it was still only medical marijuana, and I voted against it. And very simply because, as you just heard the commissioner say, it's one step, then the next, and then the next, and the next. So if you're going to start with medical marijuana, when I was there, that's what they were voting on. Said, well, don't worry, we want to see how this works out, and we'll get to the next thing, once we have a better understanding. It didn't take even a few years before full marijuana, and obviously, as you just heard what's going on in Colorado, things could only get worse. And so let's just talk about, and I know the commissioner touched on this, and we'll start with you, Dr. Pelkowitz, in terms of what are the effects, now that it's legal, so what are the ramifications of that? How do people think about it differently? How are people going to act around it differently? And how, as parents, I think, sitting in the room, need to be more prepared for that?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, I'm so happy that we're having this program. There was evidently a large program today in Lakewood where the far right of the community literally convened that leadership in a way that is so refreshing, because it's so easy to just bury your hand in the sand. So in terms of the question you're asking me to address?
Now that it is legal, right? I guess more normal.
Yeah. So look, now that it's legal, I can just tell you that we could expect that it's going to require much more active kind of discussions on the part of parents. What the research shows on what happens in different parts of the world once marijuana does become legal is that one of the big impediments to kids using a substance like this in an uncontrolled way is that they no longer have to worry about the legal consequences. We come from a culture that, as we just heard from the commissioner, is extremely strict about following the law. We tend to be law-abiding people, and many of us grew up with that kind of an approach. I'll just say that there's every reason to believe that what we need to really focus on is the 3 C's of clarity, that we need to make very clear to our children what we expect of them. Clarity does make a difference. Even though your kids are always acting like they couldn't care less about what you say, and a typical adolescent doesn't want to be caught dead with you. They hide their head in the car if you're passing by a place where their friends are. But if you woke them up in the middle of the night and asked them, whose opinion do you value? Who do you turn to in a time of trouble? The vast majority are going to say, my parents. So we need to just let them know how strongly we feel about their being careful about their use of substances. We're going to hear about this in much more detail as we go on in terms of the actual dangers. The second C is the C of communication, guided by the idea that to be understood, first understand. If you want your kid to really hear you, you have to get into their head. You can't be lecturing them. You have to hear them, validate them, and listen carefully. Again, the Hebrew word ashrei, for the highest level of happiness, is tied to the word ishur, to validate. And the next and final C is just that we have to figure out a way to basically monitor them and be careful about consequences from the standpoint of monitoring in the context of a good relationship. There's no greater way to have them internalize our values than to have the combination, as the Gemara tells us, between the left hand pushing away while the right hand brings closer. And obviously there's tremendous complexity to this, but I've seen very frequently that when parents follow these basic guidelines calmly, with clarity, and in the context of love and connection, there's going to be an excellent chance that things are going to stay in a place that will be able to keep them safe, which is the dream of every parent. Yeah.
To respond to that question, the opening question of tonight, I have seen in my many conversations with adolescents, young adults, adults, now that pot, weed, marijuana is legal, why should I not engage in something that relaxes me, that doesn't cause me really any harm? They have a very compelling position, and the reason that they feel very confident in that is by the fact that it's been legalized, the government in a certain way agrees with the fact that it's not something that is necessarily so destructive, so damaging. Why is it something that I should not engage in? And myself, parents, we have to have a deeper understanding, really a compelling response to that, that we're clear about, like Dr. Palkovitz was talking about, to first and foremost have our own clarity on this topic, and then respond to them. To talk about the detrimental effects, you can make some cases about it, and they're all true. I haven't found that specifically with marijuana it's been effective as it would be when I have conversations about cocaine or heroin or meth or even alcohol. The consequences are clearer, they're less debatable than they are realistically with marijuana. But there's something else that once we really grasp it, it's clear. And it can be conveyed, I think, very convincingly. See, at the soul, it's really not written in the guidelines and the consequences, but at the soul and at the essence of what we're talking about tonight is really an individual's ability to be able to feel life, the ups and the downs, the difficulties and the joys, the frustrations and the happiness, and to work through them, to develop the ability to work through them. And when you take marijuana, weed, especially at a young age, what ends up happening is you're numbing, you're escaping, you're avoiding the sharpness, the difficulties that ultimately develop you as a human being, as a person who has depth, as a person who, after you feel loneliness, wants to connect to other people and reach out to them, wants to, by the fact that you feel sometimes unstimulated, explore the horizons of the world. So what we're doing here is we're taking away the spark of that person's eye where there's a complacency, almost a numbing. It's the loss of a soul. And in the eyes of the youth, especially adolescence, that's the age of feeling life. We replace it with an anesthetic. And it's the saddest thing when you see individuals who are supposed to be becoming the people who they're supposed to be because they are in life, are taken out of that. And that really is at the soul and at the heart of what we need to convey. What we first need to understand ourselves, and then what we need to convey to our children, that their greatness is going to come with the fact that they will experience and feel life. It's the same thing when we come to alcohol. Alcohol, one of the significant roles it plays is when I'm with other people, I don't feel good enough, I don't feel loose, I feel inferior. So what happens is alcohol becomes the thing that I can go to for the easy solution, that I get loose. So as an adolescent, we're all insecure. Instead of feeling, working with, and ultimately facing the fact, am I good enough, am I not good enough, what are they thinking about me? And then becoming an adult, realizing, oh, I am probably as good as everyone else. Whatever we work through because we feel life, that gets extracted, taken away, and ultimately we're dealing with underdeveloped people. So I can have 30, 40-year-olds in my office, and they're at the emotional maturity of a 12 or 14-year-old because they've been escaping, avoiding, not feeling life, numbing from that age, whether it's through alcohol, through weed, or other substances. So that's really at the heart and the soul of what we're talking about here. Not just the consequences of my mental or emotional impairment in the short term, but we're talking about the development of a human being over the course of life.
Dr. Tepfer, I'm going to change it up on you for a second, because I think the parents who are here, there's always that big fear of, like, what can I do about it? And the parents that are here, I think, recognize that maybe there's an issue, there's something they need to know about. I think historically, the idea that, like, oh, it's not, my kid doesn't do that, or my kid is too good for it, or my kid wouldn't even know where to get it. Talk to me for a second. Is it easily accessible? Do you think the change of the law now sort of makes it more accessible? Do you think it changes the mindset for the parents? And is there something more or less? How should we be thinking? How should parents be thinking about it?
Yeah, so I think that the legalization is really just a legality. It's really just a hurdle. In my experience, this is something that virtually everyone who wanted to have access to marijuana, to an edible, and frankly to any drug, can easily get their hands on it. I'm going to sort of take a little bit of a different approach. Obviously, I'm not a mental health expert in the way that my colleagues are, but some of what I'm seeing as a neurologist comes into play virtually every day. I'm going to try to leave out all of the people that are smoking and climbing ladders and falling, developing subdural hematomas who are being rushed to the operating room, people that are driving, that are getting involved in car accidents, because I think we all agree that all of that is bad. I'm also going to try to sort of leave out some of the people that are using marijuana appropriately. I mean, believe it or not, I'm a member of this panel, and I've told patients that they should try marijuana. But I think that the trouble begins when you're dealing with a young, immature brain, and I think that this was pointed out earlier. One of the things that marijuana does, and this was pointed out in sort of a more mega sort of scale, is alter the sort of reward system within the brain. Marijuana, like all drugs, enters the brain because the brain and the body itself produces marijuana-type substances. And a lot of these receptors are in parts of the brain that are responsible for learning, for coordination, for reward, for pleasure. And all of these things get rearranged and rewired when a young brain ingests or smokes, or however else they're getting it in them, this substance. And what that does is that it harms the person really in a way that cannot be repaired, because you're making physical changes to the brain. So certainly you can go to therapy and you can do all sorts of self-help and whatever it may be, but the damage is done. The damage is done in a way that affects the ability to have relationships with others. The damage is done in terms of the ability to hold down a job. And of course, this is happening during a pivotal time in development. And there really is no good way to go back on this.
So we jumped sort of right into the conversation of marijuana and legalization. Let's take a step back for a second and talk about alcohol. I know, again, since I'm a kid, right, some schools have, some schools bar it. Do we make it too easy for kids at kiddish to take a drink? Do we encourage it? Are we sending the wrong message? Let's talk for a second. Has there been, and I'll sort of throw this to each of you, has there been sort of an increase over the years? I mean, this is something that we've been talking about literally since I'm a kid. Is this something that's increasing? Is it more problem today than it was, let's say, 20 or 30 years ago? And how do you think things are proceeding, and what should parents be worried about? We can start with you, Dr.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find any really good, solid, reliable data that gets at that. But certainly impressionistically, I feel that it has been increasing from what I'm seeing. And you know, one of the main reasons is shifts in parenting. Parents have a much harder time saying no, have a much harder time setting limits, much harder time modeling responsible kind of drinking. And especially during COVID, many parents have been a little burned out. So my impression is that it has gotten worse. Have either of you seen actually any good solid data in our neighborhood on this stuff?
Yeah, I'm not coming from a data standpoint. I speak to and present at different schools the last decade. Every principal I have interacted with of our local schools has personally told me not just an increase, but the level that they're dealing with this in their 11th and 12th grades compared to 5 and 10 years ago are astronomical. So that's just anecdotal data, and that's been their impression. And then personally, many individuals who have come to me who either in the last year or two have started to either use or use more. There's no question in terms of the last year or so with COVID, students 17, 18 who've been out of schools and definitely are going to that. And then I would take a step back. To me, I just connect this to a larger societal shift. I think it has to do with the parenting. And then, like a lot of data, around 2009, 2010, there's a huge shift when it comes to data about teens regarding happiness, regarding levels of loneliness. And around 2010 is when technology became sophisticated enough that it has any and every piece of entertainment, music, and social connection, so to speak, that you need all in one device called a smartphone, an iPhone. And what that did was it shifted my need to rely upon human beings to have a good time, and it made it very impersonal that I can connect with an object and interact. And that shift, to me, is also monumental because what substances are in their essence is a relationship with something instead of someone, and it has this reliability and it has this control to it that human beings can never offer. And therefore, it just follows that trend to me. A lot more isolation, being with oneself. Kids don't go out. I was doing one of the, it was a freshman open house. This goes back a few years ago. They had like a week and a half off in between camp and school, and then the freshmen came, and I was doing this, and I said, I want to just ask you, the last week and a half you had off, so how many of you guys got together with one another? Play basketball? Not one hand went up. I said, what'd you do the last week and a half to keep busy? And every single one of them used primarily technology as their outlet to enjoy themselves. And that's like a societal shift. And then that shifts right into how I'm going to ultimately deal with things in life. It won't be necessarily with getting together with people. It'll be an isolated thing, which ultimately is my relationship with the substance. So that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, how often do you go to a wedding and you see the chassan and kala texting each other around 4 minutes after they're married, right? I mean, it's kind of scary. But just in terms of the linkage between alcohol and marijuana, I think that they're clearly very similar things. I think if you're doing one, you're doing the other. And the way to sort of look at it, the difference between use and abuse is what void are you filling? Or are you filling a void in your life by partaking in that substance? And if the answer to that question is yes, then that's no good, right? That's something you should not be doing, right? So, clearly there's a difference between making Kiddush Friday night and, that kind of thing. But if you're consuming alcohol to try to numb some problem, you're not dealing with it appropriately. And what's going to end up happening is that wine will become the scotch, will become the marijuana, will become leftover Percocet in the medicine cabinet, and before you know it, we have real problems. And at that point, you're so entrenched in the problem, you're so entrenched in the addiction that it's very difficult to get out.
Well, let me ask you, and something you touched on, we'll stay with you, Dr. Solomon, for a minute. So is there such a thing as moderation? And we could talk about, obviously there's no such thing as moderation when you're 14, but
yeah.
Are you 18, you're in shul? Is there a right way to do this? Is there a wrong way to do this?
I see 18 and 14 and 25 and 32 as being very similar, right? I mean, it really depends on the kind of person you are and the stage of life that you're at, right? I mean, you have a 32-year-old who has the sort of intellectual substance of an 18-year-old, and sometimes you see 18-year-olds that are far advanced and beyond their years. But certainly, again, I bring it all back to why are you doing the thing that you're doing, right? I think everybody in this room has had a little scotch on Shabbos, right? And I don't think any of us really see that as being a problem. And that's because there has to be a boundary. There has to be a limit. And where that limit is, thankfully, is more up to my mental health colleagues than myself. But the limit is what's important.
So I'm going to stay with you for one more minute.
Please.
We're touching on an interesting idea. Is removing it the answer then? Meaning,
No,
right?
no.
When you think about moderation, too much, the idea that shuls now are dry, right? It's a dry shul, so my son can't get alcohol because my shul's a dry shul.
Right. Well, the shul is dry, but the kiddush that I'm having in my house afterwards is going to be the wettest kiddush you've ever been at, right? So I think the notion that everything could be banned, and when we ban something, then it'll go away. I mean, that's not real, right? Just because you don't screen for cancer doesn't mean there is no longer cancer. Just because you stop testing for COVID doesn't mean there is no more COVID, right? I can bring it all full circle here, okay? So the idea is, how do we deal with this? How do we live with this? What do we do so that we can raise our children responsible so that they're not doing these things in excess? And I will say, just bringing it back to, sort of the stuff that I'm seeing, marijuana, okay, but this isn't 1963, and the marijuana is not the good stuff. The marijuana that people are buying is often laced with PCP, it's often laced with cocaine, it's often synthetic. All of this is a whole different ballgame in terms of causing stroke, causing seizure, causing heart attack. So it's a very, very different game than it was even when we were younger. And I think that often gets thrown to the wayside. I know you'd mentioned before that people think that this is harmless stuff. Yeah, I mean, sure, smoking one joint may not be the end of your life, but it just might be.
So let's just stay with you, Dr. Tepfer, if we can. So talk to me about where you think or what you've seen in terms of age differences. And then again, is there such a thing as moderation? And I'd love to hear your thoughts also on, in terms of, should we just, if it's banned, then it's okay?
Right, sure. And you're talking about alcohol, you're talking about marijuana, alcohol. So my strong opinion, based on my experience, is that there needs to be a very strong, clear, united front, parents, rabbeim, teachers, communities, shuls, that send a very clear, united message, one message, that underage children should not have any access to alcohol, and we shouldn't allow that, period. I'm not talking about wine after your kiddush. I'm talking about there should be a clear, consistent message. And I say that because it's troubling. There are a few different places or avenues where I see that that's not adhered to, and it causes problems. So one of the, I would say, I'll use the word cheap or easy ways I've seen rabbeim connect with talmidim, whether it was in Israel, whether it's even in high schools, would be a no-neg Friday night, and he's the cool rebbe, and he's bringing out alcohol to his talmidim. And I'm sorry, there are many other ways to be a cool rebbe and to connect to your talmidim. And there has to be a uniform message, whether it's in the summer, whether it's you giving up your house and allowing boys and girls to come over and have an open house. Those are things that, as parents, you need to be on board. Shuls can do the same thing. Can men have a kiddush? For sure, and they need to be mature about it. But should there be teenagers that roam from shul to shul and go from kiddush to kiddush, which happens? So when shuls unite and don't allow that, schools unite, parents unite, rabbeim unite. I think that there's a consistent message. And then when a kid is responsible and older and has seen his parents engage with alcohol in moderation, then they're mature enough to follow those role models. But how can you expect a 16 or 17-year-old to make great decisions when the brain is not developed, when there's such insecurity? It's not fair to them.
Dr. Halter, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, when I was younger, a long time ago, I used to quote the European studies, or the vignettes from Europe, where if you went to this, parts of France or parts of Italy, it was a truism that if parents modeled responsible drinking, and they'd have with their adolescent children a bottle of wine with every dinner, that there seemed to be pretty strong evidence back then that there was much lower rates of alcoholism because it wasn't forbidden fruit. And I grew up in a home where, my father and family members were by no means drinkers. I think I grew up with the same bottle of Chivas for my entire childhood, not too far from here. But there was no forbidden fruit. And I think it worked back then. But things have changed. Things have really changed. In other words, I think that I'm not as comfortable as I used to be, where I used to be the hero of every kiddush club. When the OU banned kiddush clubs, I was quoted in the New York Times for advocating model responsible drinking. But the way kids learn how to control alcohol intake is for us to model just, regular kinds of drinking. That was back in a much simpler world. What we're hearing now is you have to, as the world changes, you have to tighten up the controls. And you have to, I think, really come up with I think, a much more all or nothing kind of an approach.
Something I think that many of you are thinking, because oftentimes when we think about the challenges of alcohol, we think about the kiddish, and we think about the father and the son. I want to shift, before we get into marijuana, we're going to talk about that a bit more. I want to talk about the difference between, Dr. Pelkowitz, we'll stay with you, girls versus boys. Is it different? Are they wired differently? Are they more prone to drink? Like, is a girl more prone to drink like a boy? Is it the same challenges, pressures, or so on?
Okay, so in general, when you look at all of the literature on this kind of behavior, boys are wired differently. They're much more likely to be faced with a different set of psychological challenges than girls. Higher rate of depression and anxiety, and self-medicating anxiety and depression in a way that makes it very different. But that's changed also. So that I think that lately there's been, in the literature on kids who develop substance abuse problems, it's been evening out. Very often when girls do develop problems in this area, they may start even earlier than boys do, which is a whole added level of risk. So we can't in any way just relax and tell ourselves, you don't have to worry about your daughters, because we have to be just as careful with them as we have to be with our sons.
Dr. Tepfer?
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Pelkowitz said. There's a changing world in terms of gender differences. Although in the frum world, there are, my experience running an IOP for addictions and for trauma, we see a whole different set usually of coping mechanisms with boys than with girls. Boys or men will generally go to more addictive behaviors in terms of self-medicating. And those things are usually internalized with women in a different type of way. They'll go to different coping mechanisms in terms of dealing with emotional things and traumas. So it presents differently, but addiction is still very possible with girls. Anecdotally, I've just seen a higher rate of reacting to traumas and different emotional things with boys going to addiction, whereas girls, women, struggling with mood and relationships and other there's sometimes self-harm, other escape behaviors in place of that in terms of level between boys and girls. That's been my experience.
So, Justin, I'm going to get right back to you. In the interest of time, and I just want to apologize, we're not going to be taking personal questions. There will be time after the program to address the panelists. I know Rabbi Silver is here and others are here. And so I apologize in advance that we're not going to be taking a personal question. So with that, Dr. Solomon, let's actually get into kind of the physical, we're talking sort of boys versus girls, physical and neurological effects of alcohol, of marijuana, and the difference is not just boys and girls maybe, but, and we touched upon this earlier, sort of adolescents versus adults.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of this, again, has to do with brain development. I think that when you throw a drug, be that drug either alcohol or marijuana, on a non-fully developed brain, I think that you are asking for trouble. One of the things that most commonly happens is sort of the induction of psychosis, right? So there's this association between marijuana and schizophrenia and having beliefs that are not real. Now, I know that my psychology colleagues will say, well, maybe they're more prone to schizophrenia, and this is a way of self-treating, and that may be, right? I mean, there may be a cause without an effect. But certainly this is something that we see, and it's something that we see pretty often. I have multiple patients, and I have seen and interacted with multiple people who used marijuana minimally and have developed schizophrenia and are now being treated for schizophrenia. So I hate to say the slippery slope hypothesis, but it certainly is something that is dangerous in the wrong hands. And again, these are usually young people, right? Older people, I don't have that fear. You know, the 50-year-old who's treating a diabetic neuropathy with marijuana is very different than the teenager.
Moving, again, Dr. Tepfer, similar, right? Adolescents versus adults, sort of what you're seeing.
Yeah. There was a fascinating study. It wasn't a research study. It was done by the New York Times. They asked, what music throughout your life do you strongest connect to, and that you have the kind of most intense and passionate response to? The music that you heard at which stage in your life? And they polled 1,000, 1,500 people, and the study came out very clearly that the music that you heard during your adolescent years, the songs, the singers, was the music that the rest of your life, if you would hear that, you had the most emotional, strongest connection to and response to. And the hypothesis was or is that, as we were saying before, the most emotionally intense and rich time in a person's life, when you're just starting to feel things and feel things very intensely, are those adolescent years. That's why the dreams are big, the pain is very big, the despair, all the emotions are felt very, very strongly. So to answer your question, when you introduce anything that deals with emotions, weed, alcohol, anything, friendships, song, whatever it is, the connection at that age and that stage in life is so intense and so strong. So the research then follows. Those that use marijuana daily during teenage years will have a very difficult time later on in life pulling away from it. Those that allow themselves to develop connections to rebellion, to friends, to activities, to feel life, like we were talking about before. These are the years that we want them to become people. That happens then. So it's the most vulnerable time in life.
Well, let me ask, and a few people have mentioned, oh, go ahead. A few people have mentioned sort of the correlation between kind of the changes because of technology and how that plays into it, and we'll stay with you for a minute. I mean, how much is that, right? Is it technology that draws the adolescent out, and now he feels himself lost? I mean, how much is it connected? How much is it sort of independent?
Well, what I was alluding to before, and I'd like the opinion of others on this as well, is that to me it's a very similar process of disconnecting from others, other things, other activities, and the ability to just sit really in more of a solitary, disconnected state and then get my needs filled. And that happens, A, with technology, and then the addiction entire model is person-object relationship, person-substance relationship. Often we see that instead of me connecting with people, children who didn't grow up with secure attachment will develop that secure attachment to the substance instead of to a person. And technology these days, twofold, is causing that to happen. You have parents who, as parents, we're all challenged and we're all in our own connection with technology, not there to connect with our kids. And then our kids are connecting to technology instead of to human beings and to activities. And that just really feeds right into all addictions.
So I'll stay with you for one more minute. Yeah. Commissioner Ryder talked about this, sort of the different types, right? Is CBD okay? Is it not okay? And so talk to me about THC versus CBD versus, and what are the negative effects?
Yeah, so we know, I mean, THC is the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, and that's the thing that will affect a person's mood and perception. That's arguably the addictive part of marijuana, and that's what we're talking about is legalized and problematic. CBD itself, you can buy over the counter, take, and experiment yourselves. I don't think you will notice any significant effect, impairment. It has anti-inflammatory health effects that they're still trying to study. I don't think that that's at all what we're talking about problematic. It's the THC piece that we're talking about. There are different variants. It's interesting now. There's the Delta 9, which is the one that's becoming legalized, and then there's the Delta 8, which is less psychoactive. But these are the pieces of the puzzle in terms of THC. That's what we're talking about. The CBD element, the hemp element, is not, to the best of my knowledge, anything that's of a concern.
So, Dr. Pelkovitz, let me ask you a question, and I sort of, again, and is there a concept of a gateway drug, right? You hear about this all the time. If you do this, you're more likely to do that. Again, if you do one crime, you're more likely to escalate. If I smoke a cigarette, I'm more likely to smoke marijuana, and if I do that, I'm more likely to take the next step. I mean, is there truth to that? If, well, my son's only, or my daughter is only smoking cigarettes, so I'm okay, is there a fear that there's a natural next step?
Yeah, my understanding is that when it comes to marijuana and certainly alcohol, that there is some longitudinal data that suggests that it can be the beginning of a slippery slope. And it's impossible to really predict whether or not you're in the subset of people who it becomes a gateway drug that's going to mess around with your brain, especially in adolescence. You know, you think about what's the most precious part of who our children are. And when we think about, you know, the gematria of ahava, the Hebrew word for love, is identical to the gematria, the numerical equivalent for the Hebrew word worry. Love and worry are inextricably intertwined. And to me, this is terrifying, because we're talking about, with the tremendously increased strength of marijuana relative to when we were younger, with the increasing knowledge that this is a time of life that is extremely sensitive in terms, you know, there's a reason why, you know, in Jewish thought, we weren't full bar unshin until we're in our 20s. It's because there was an understanding even back then that that we're not fully formed until later. If you mess around with that at this age, you know, why is it that so many coming-of-age movies are the most common movies and the formula for success in Hollywood? It's because it's about the coming of age and our attraction to the humor and music and challenges of adolescence. We don't want to get in the way of that intensity. I mean, I think we're all preaching to the converted here, but it's just that sometimes I think parents aren't aware of that. And let me just say one last thing. There's, I think, a fear that many parents have of thinking back to the reefer madness films. You know, like you don't want to be like those old people when we were younger who talked about reefer madness. You know, that if you take marijuana, you're going to drive yourself crazy. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about an emerging body of research based on advances in neuroscience, based on advances in terms of what our children are ingesting. And we have to open our mind to the reality that this is a very different kind of challenge than it was when we were younger. And, you know, yeah.
Dr. Solomon?
Yeah, no, I think to that point, I think there's also a fear among parents that by discussing it, you sort of introduce the idea, and that's something that comes up with multiple topics. You know, I can say a little bit from even personal experience that that's simply not the case, right? I mean, the kids are well versed in things beyond what I know about it. So I think that's also something that comes up very frequently.
We learned that during the technology webinar also, that the kids know a lot more than we do.
Yeah.
So again, staying with you, talked about, Dr. Solomon, the long-term effects, right? So I know we've touched on it a number of times, but, you know, there's an idea of, well, I only use it occasionally versus I use it all the time versus I'm fully addicted and I'm doing it a lot. Is there a difference, long-term effects-wise, sort of, and how do you
Yeah, so just to Dr. Pelkowicz's point, I think that while we don't know who's going to be addicted, we do know that the younger you are when you start, the more likely you are to develop an addiction and a physiologic dependency. And that is, of course, very dangerous. We all know people who smoke too much. We've all interacted with them. You don't need me as the neurologist to sit here and tell you that there's something wrong. These people, and again, I'm sort of leaving out the artsy types that can paint better or write better music or sing better or whatever it may be. But the people that we know day to day that are using these substances have tremendous difficulty functioning in society. Certainly there are exceptions, and I'm not looking to paint with a broad brush, but certainly they are impaired, and the impairment is such that their brain is completely rewired. They require different levels of stimuli to get to the same place that someone who is not addicted can get to. And just think about that. Think about how scary that is, right? So think about how much more they need of a substance, how much more they need to get to that sort of reward, pleasure sort of area, right? As was pointed out, there's a numbing, there's an anesthetic effect, which makes some of these people much more prone to not being able to appreciate life in the way that others can.
Let me sort of just stay with you for a second in terms of, gateway. You had mentioned earlier alcohol, marijuana.
Yeah.
It's the same problem, a different side of the same problem.
I mean, there is a ton of research that is conflicting about whether or not marijuana is truly a gateway drug or not, right? But I can tell you in my experience, it certainly is, right? There are very few people that try marijuana, become addicted to marijuana, and don't start to dabble in other things. And that has to do with simply having a personality type that is more prone to addiction, more prone to wanting to feel something externally rather than trying to feel something internally. While I can't sort of speak with data to back up the point, I can certainly say that in my experience, and certainly the experience of my colleagues, one thing definitely leads to another.
And so going back to you, Dr. Pepfer, and you seem to be the resident expert at THC, CBD, now talk about the different types of ways of consuming it. Eat it, you smoke it, various ways, sort of, are there different effects? Do all the questions and answers to the questions we've been talking about change based on the way in which you've consumed it?
Yeah, sure. Well, the common ways are to either smoke a joint, which would be to take marijuana and roll it up and smoke it. You can vape it, where it's burned and the vapors are ingested through a pipe. It's a bong. You can vape it these days, where then you eliminate the smell and you just have a THC cartridge where you then ingest it that way. And then there are edibles. And some of the differences and some of the really the severe cases happen with edibles for the simple reason that edibles don't hit until they're digested and then hit the bloodstream and then hit the brain, which is usually 30, 45, or 60 minutes later, whereas any of the other forms are usually within a few minutes. They'll hit the brain. So you have the high right away. So what happens with edibles is that person does not feel the effect, eats more, and then it hits. And often there's a dose that's way above the range that the person can handle. And very often, I mean, the side effects we haven't really spoken about, but there's intense anxiety, paranoia to many people. in their experiences with marijuana. With edibles, you're going to have a very long high because it's going to stay in your system, so you can wake up the next morning throughout the next day and still be high on an edible because it's long-term in the system in terms of its digestion, whereas ingesting it the other ways, smoking it, will have it's usually a few hours. It's much more limited. So there are differences in terms of how. And then there's new forms which are even more dangerous. You know, the concentration in terms of dabbing and other things are even higher. The thing is with edibles also, you don't know the amounts that were really put in either. And then you have people being rushed to emergency rooms, having high levels, and then we were discussing laced with other things as well. So those are some of the different forms and the different consequences based on the form.
And either one of you, do you see, again, is it one more accessible than others? Are you seeing kids or young adults that gravitate in one direction or another?
Well, now with vaping, with wax pens, what's happened is since the odor of marijuana has been eliminated with that, you'll have people that are walking around all day high. I have that, you know, many clients are like that, many individuals are like that, and there is no smell, there is no odor, they're used to it, and being high all day touches on a lot of the points that we were talking about. These are individuals that have no motivation in life, do not get together with other people with the same interest, do not study for tests with any sense of urgency, do not learn well, remember things, have no motivation to go places. It's a sad person to sit across. And then the therapy is actually very frustrating because they don't really care what I say to them either because they're in the not caring mode.
Dr. Pelkovitz, let me sort of go to you in terms of turning the conversation in terms of, okay, so what do parents do, right? So do you wait until you see habitual behavior? Do you wait until you see it one time? You know, I saw my son, you know, across the room. He didn't think I was looking, but I saw him take a half a shot of something. Is that where I put down my foot, or is there, so what's the right time, and then how do you approach that?
Yes, I think the right time is now. The right time is, you don't have to wait. Your kid's going to be much more receptive if you're striking when the iron is cold. You're talking to them at a time of calmness. You could say, I went to a program at Beth Shalom that, sponsored by all these specialists in this area.
Great speakers.
And unbelievable kind of entertainment. Because I know you're going to sing a little bit later, possibly tell jokes. And use that as a point for being able to talk it out and to share some of the things that you learned. And to even say things like, I feel very strong. I remember going back to my childhood when back when I was bar mitzvah, not too far from here in the White Shul, every single bar mitzvah party, every kid had at his plate a cup filled with cigarettes. And everybody would smoke. It's just the way it was. My father, when he was bar mitzvah in Yerushalayim, because that's where he grew up, in Jerusalem, what you had at your bar mitzvah is you would give out a pack of cigarettes and I think some schnapps and some herring. That was the big bar mitzvah party. And life has changed. Life has changed. But you have to talk about it, because my mother would tell me, basically, the essence of, she knew how to make me guilty. She'd say, it would break my heart if I thought you ever smoked. Because my father used to smoke, and it was very hard for him to quit. And he did eventually quit. But now it's so much harder to stop because of vaping. So we have to get ahead of the curve, I believe.
Yeah, I want to piggyback on what Dr. Pelkovitz was saying and add a dimension to it, obviously in addition to the conversations, to remain, I don't know the right word, very curious because if our children, our students, are going to these substances, when I say by very curious, there's often, I've found, I hate saying the word always, there's almost always, or there's always, with maybe a little asterisk, always something that is going on in a kid who is going to weed or alcohol regularly, daily, addictively, dependently. And so what I want to say is it's never just about the consequence if you ever do that again. Once it's at that level, just as a rule of thumb, you'll be safe if you see it that way, there is always a deeper issue, reason going on. That doesn't mean then that you let it happen. It means that in addition to stopping it, that needs to be looked at and explored in a deeper way, maybe with the school, with professionals, but dependency doesn't happen in a void vacuum. There's always, whether it's emotional issues, family relationship issues, traumas, there's something coming out by going to a substance addictively, in my experience. So that's just to add that perspective to what the behavior is perhaps showing.
And Dr. Solomon, I'd love, again, if you can provide some sort of insight. So what do parents say in terms of how they approach their kids, in terms of the effects, what you see, what you hear from your colleagues?
Yeah, I think that it boils down to all parenting, which I think is what we touched upon, which is modeling behavior. And I think that the earlier this behavior is modeled, certainly the better it is for the child. I will just add, just in terms of the different types of substances, and not to just be the sort of the total doctor on the stage and whatever, but smoking something puts you at risk for all the stuff that cigarettes put you at risk for. So while it may or may not be true that smoking and edibles and whatever are sort of the same from a drug perspective, certainly smoking puts you at risk for the whole sort of gamut of atherosclerotic malignancy, all the sort of bad things that we know about because the package of cigarette says so on it. So just to sort of throw that into the mix.
Okay, and no, I think it's important. I think it's important, again, as things evolve, you forget the foundation for the problem that we started a long time ago. So we spent a lot of time talking about adolescence, and I'm hesitant to bring this up with my wife sitting in the room, but discuss the effects you're seeing on marriages when one spouse is taking advantage or utilizing alcohol, marijuana. I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about kids and the effects. Talk about it in adults for a second. Dr. Puckwitz, we could start with you.
Yeah, sure. I often quote a study done by a number of doctoral students in our graduate school, in Israeli Graduate School, Yeshiva University, that were done by a number of our doctorates were on looking at the answer to that question, which is basically what happens when parents are giving inconsistent messages. What happens when there's fighting between parents over any issue, and particularly an issue as truly worthy as what we're talking about tonight. And it's very hard to bite your tongue, especially when you think that your child's brain and soul and future are at risk. With that being said, every one of the dissertations that were done at Azrieli on this found something very clear, which is that if you fight over something, even in private, your child will pick up on it and they will not internalize that value. You have to bite your tongue and talk about it quietly out of your child's hearing and make that into the guiding kind of principle. And when you do that, eventually, hopefully, you'll be able to come up with an approach that could promote internalization. But it's hard to do, but it's a very, very worthy goal to have.
Dr. Tepfer, I mean, talk to us sort of real life. What are you seeing?
Wreaks havoc on relationships. I spend my week with picking up the pieces of those relationships, trying to put them back together. And the reason is because usually you'll have one spouse, whether it's I'll take a typical case, whether it's when it's a wife, bothered and broken by the fact that her husband either gets high weekly, nightly, or comes home buzzed or smashed or plastered from a kiddush, whether it's now it's not just Shabbos day, but there's already pregame Thursday night starts, and then there's Erev Shabbos, and then there's Friday night owning, and then it goes straight into Shabbos, and then there's leftovers by Matzah Shabbos. It's a whole Lava Malka. It's a whole. But the reason why it causes havoc is because that person who is affected, if you think about it from a relational standpoint, what's happening is you're impossible to really relate to and to empathize back with that individual, with that person. They'll often become, not often, they are ineffective parents at that point with children, not only ineffective, very often destructive and loose, and what are they modeling for children when they come home? So you'll have a spouse broken by the fact that I have 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 kids with a father coming home from a kiddush, falling asleep before a Suda, sleeping straight through Shabbos. What do I tell my 4 or 5 or 6-year-old? Where's and I'm giving you one of a million examples. And just relationally, the two of them, that person says, well, I'm chilled out. It's impossible. The whole practice of intimacy to begin with is such a subtle, fine-tuned art in the best of cases when two people are trying to be emotionally attuned with one another. So it is impossible when someone is affected by whether it's alcohol or whether it's some substance and the other person is trying to, it really makes emotional connection and intimacy impossible. The other person is an inauthentic, unconnectable person. And that's when it's mild. And then when it gets to further levels, you're dealing with a person who's irrational and abusive, destructive, out of control. I don't want to break people's hearts, but there's endless stories of spouses waiting for hours, for nights, with husbands who don't come home, or it can be vice versa, come home high, say things, throw things, act certain ways, trust is broken, and that person is unreliable. So it makes relationships impossible.
So what are the warning signs? And I throw this.
Let me just say one thing, because I don't want the evening to go without talking about some positives, okay? I think it's important because I see people looking more and more depressed as the evening's going on.
But it's a 9 days. They came for that. It's a 9 days.
I know, right. Yeah, this is why we have the program always. It's just the role of, from a positive psychology standpoint, of joy. Bringing joy into our lives is one antidote. The role of simcha, so that there isn't such a gaping hole to fill. And the joy of humor, and the crucial role of stillness. Whenever I've been in programs that have talked about this topic in a way that gets a little bit deeper into, how do we promote spiritual connection that would serve as the antidote, including Rabbi Dr. Twersky, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, he would always talk about these things. You need a place of stillness. You need a place of, where we could just connect without looking at our phones. And it's what Shabbos should be all about. and a place of just having fun and taking pressure off and playing games, things like that. That's not a small thing, because that's ultimately getting to the, to the prevention part of things.
Yeah. Can I piggyback, because Dr. Pelkovitz really shifted us to where we need to shift at the end, and that's why he has helped our community so much with those type of perspectives. I think that there are many people in the crowd here, some of you I know personally, heads of organizations who will agree with me that the people who are vulnerable to what we're talking about tonight, to alcohol and to weed, really fitting with all the points that we were saying, when these individuals who are more often than not struggling through things emotionally, difficult relationships from a family, difficult traumas that they've gone through, and they're able to emerge, whether as parents we're able to support them through those years, they end up not being average adults. They end up being above average. They end up being really special, tremendous contributors to society, to our communities. They end up being exceptional people. It's because of a lot of the points we were talking about. You're going there because you have a lot going on inside. And if you can tap into the stillness and to the simcha, if those neshamas are helped to get through it, they end up being really above and beyond other kids. That there's that potential there.
I'll drink to that.
So let me just ask one final question. We can control what we can control, right? When our kids are home, when they're in our presence. How do you control them when they're not at home, right? We talked for a minute about, they're away at yeshiva or they're going to a friend's house for Shabbos, and my friend's parents said it was okay, right? It goes back to something as simple as we only drink water in our house. My friend's parents said we could drink soda, right? As much as they want. So why is it a problem here, not a problem there? And why are their parents any more right or wrong than you are? That permeates, that continues to evolve to bigger and greater things. So how do you manage sort of that part of the conversation? I say this as pragmatic parents who are going home, who hopefully are going to have that conversation while the iron is cold with their kids. So how do you address that? Well, my friend's parents said it's okay. Nobody wants to answer the question.
I'll take a stab at it before my wiser colleagues do. I think that, there's a great saying from the Kutzker that I often quote, that there's nothing as unequal as the equal treatment of children, okay? There's nothing as unequal as the equal treatment of children. We treat each of our children according to their unique needs. Every kid that I've seen in my over 40 years of practice has told me, has complained about, my friend's always allowed to do this, my friend's always allowed to do that. I've yet to meet that friend. Okay, wherever I go. I've been in Australia, I've been in South Africa, I've been in all different parts of the world, and it's just part of what kids do. So I think that we just have to keep in mind that kids don't have to necessarily like what we're doing or what we're saying. They just have to do it. And as long as it's coming from a place of love, connection, and equality, and 3 ingredients, and with that I'll hand it over, in setting up limits. Calmness is all important. Calmness without yelling, screaming, and criticism. They're more likely to accept that. Being logical, it should make sense. If it doesn't feel like arbitrary authority, which any adolescent, that's poison for. So it's calmness, logical, and also delivered in a way that that is not forever, brief. If you could have a consequence, it could be as short as one night. It's never like grounding your kid for the rest of their lives. And when you have those 3 ingredients, I find that, especially in the context of doing what parents have to do, knowing where your child is, which parents in the non-Jewish world always insist on knowing. I mean, there's very interesting statistics on it. Know where they are. Have connections with you as a community, with your friends' parents. Know what they're doing. And your kid will complain about it, but that's something that is very much associated with long-term prevention.
Dr. Tepfer, have you met that friend?
He is that friend.
Your question is the question. You know, there's the story there's a fascinating story in the Gemara where there was an individual, Elazar ben Dardai, and he was able to cross 7 oceans, right? All the restrictions in the world, they're good and they're important as a community, a family, parents, but when there's the will of an individual, then all the restrictions ultimately are able to be overcome. And then you have another fascinating, whole different character, which is the character of Yosef alone. Not just is there no restrictions, there's a person who is begging and pulling at his jacket to have him cross over his values and have this relationship. And the thing that stops Yosef is a picture of his father, right? Demus diakno shalaviv. So the 7 oceans don't stop an individual and a child, but the picture of a father, when you're alone in a faraway, dark land, is the one thing that's able to hold a child back. And so you're asking, how do we have that our pictures somehow are in the minds and the imagination of our children? And I don't think there's a shortcut to that. I think it's we pray, we daven, we try our hardest to be loving, caring, involved parents who give to our children the biggest commodity that we can, and that's our time and our heart and our soul. And with that, we pray that it's our face that they see when they're alone in that friend's house and the parent is not home. That relationship is ultimately the thing that I don't know anything better than that.
So I hope that tonight was not the beginning of the conversation. I really, really hope that it's not the end of the conversation. Thankfully, we have great organizations in our community that are available to us every single day, and so make sure you take advantage if you need help to call Madraigos and, of course, Achiezer, and to the amazing staff putting this together and for the work they do every day. And, of course, to our amazing panelists, thank you so much for sharing your expertise, and I hope you'll continue to do the great work that you do.